Welcome back, everybody, to Santa Fe Fashion Week, Fashion Behind the Curtain podcast. I'm Stephen Cuomo, executive producer of Santa Fe Fashion Week. I'm really excited to have Dwight online. Welcome to our podcast, Dwight.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, name is Dwight Carter, St. Louis born and raised, and I'm in the more the event side of the fashion industry. I did spend a lot of time in retail and did a lot of styling and personal shopping and that side. I did the PR and the marketing. I've kind of touched all bases on fashion. My background started in the music industry as a more of a concert promoter of music, like festival producer. Uh, did some tours, managed some bands, and then kind of transitioned into fashion and took everything I learned there and put it into what I'm doing now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. It's interesting. We just had Boots in the Park, which I'm just starting to learn how to dance country. And I guess, they put on events throughout the country. And last year they did a 1 day event. And I guess it had such huge success that they did a 2 day event. So, how would you say that's helped you as far as your background with producing events, be it music into now fashion?
It helped a lot because it's kind of similar. You got to have your venue. You need your staging sometimes. Sound, lighting, all the production crew. Um, it's entertainment, just like anything else. And so having that, I think having that like mentality of putting on a rock show or a big type production makes the fashion shows cooler. And then just you have your little shows where you may do it in a smaller venue and it's low production, but like having that big idea and that goal to have it to be make an impact on the audience. I think that's what really I took from producing more of like a concert style of an event.
Yeah, I've been giving this a lot of thought. It's interesting because with again going back to Boots in the Park, they had some, I forget the name of some of the bigger bands, but that's some bigger bands, but those are really driven by ticket sales, and then you have to take those sales, maybe they have some vendors and maybe a sponsor. I'm not sure if they had a sponsor or not. Um, so they have to raise enough money via ticket sales. So they must have a lot of upfront money to cover their costs and then recouping it through ticket sales and then paying the big bands, if you will. Where fashion shows, at least the ones I'm producing, are kind of like a three-legged stool, right? Because designers pay some money to be in the show, and then you have sponsors and then ticket sales. So how did that kind of translate for you? Because I'm imagining the same thing, right? If you're doing a music festival, you're paying the performers, if you will, and in a fashion show, the performers, in a way, which are the designers, are actually helping cover some of the costs. Do you find that to be the same thing for you?
Yeah, we don't charge a lot. I haven't really charged designers for anything.
Okay.
We try and get as cover a lot of cost through sponsorship. Doesn't say that's ever going to change. Um, it's just what we've always done. Sponsors have been great to cover the most of the expense of the event. Um, and that's again, me coming from the background of a musician who doesn't have any funds to pay to play basically,
Right.
which is a lot of you hear that on the like west coast east coast sometimes where they have to pay to play basically to be in a certain venue. So yeah, so that's I've taken a lot of the my music production background into fashion, and I don't know if it's the right way to do it as a business person, but I think it's just me trying to help the creative, because in my opinion that if if I get a designer that gets something out of a fashion show, maybe makes more sales than anybody else, or gets noticed by a certain media, or gets some major exposure, then that's a win for me as well. I'm thinking more of the passion of it, and the business side is something that I you know I obviously will struggle with a little bit on my end. um, But I also think that, designers that pay to be in fashion shows are paying for, to have a fashion show. They're paying for the production, they're paying to get all the marketing and PR, and it's valuable, especially when they get something out of it. Like, it's a valuable investment for them. Uh,
Right.
yeah, so I guess you know, I go back and forth on that topic, but I do see the value of paying to be in you know a major production.
Right. I mean, to me, it's I think it's more like a co-op. If you're a big designer like a Tom Ford or Marc Jacobs, and they're typically just doing their own shows, which could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. Where these more emerging designers or indie designers, almost like indie musicians, right?
Hmm.
They don't have that kind of money, so to be part of a show, and let's say, I mean, just in Santa Fe, the space might be 10 or 15 grand for a day or two. It's very expensive, and
Hmm.
so to have maybe 10 designers paying $1,000 or so to participate in that in that in that show. Because the thing is, at least as far as I'm concerned, when you're going after sponsors, and you may see the same thing when you're going after sponsors, some of them might just do it out of the goodness of the heart, but most of them are going to be, it's a business decision. So if they have $5,000 or $7,000 to be maybe a presenting sponsor, they're going to be like, well, I could take that $7,000 and put into radio ads or TV ads or billboard ads or Facebook ads and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So it's really about how many people or how many eyeballs are going to be able to capture with that money. And some of them, I kind of pitch it in a way that I don't know if you ever saw the movie Jerry Maguire, but
Hmm.
giving back to the community where the if a car dealership, let's say, says, well, if $6,000 I could buy an ad in the newspaper or whatever, I kind of spin it more like, yeah, you obviously could do that, or you could sponsor Santa Fe Fashion Week and invite your best customers, or let's say your best salespeople, the GM, whatever, give back to the community, invite them to this event,
Hmm.
so they're getting something out of it. And so way to, if you're writing a newspaper ad, there's no way to use that to translate to giving thanks to, let's say, someone who's bought a lot of cars from you or your top performing salesperson. But again, it's to me, and that's one way to kind of to pitch it to sponsors, I think.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's hard when you're trying to squeeze all that money out of the sponsors, and then those sponsors also obviously get some VIP tickets to the show. So you have that portion of it, right? And then you have ticket sales, and for us here in Santa Fe, you're kind of hindered by the size of the space, how many, what price per ticket, and then how many people can that room hold.
Hmm.
So you have that, and so and then vendors, so those are kind of like those three ways to generate income. And I also think with designers having some skin in the game, because if you say, oh, all of you can come here for free and stuff like that, and then for whatever reason, a couple of them pull out, something comes up, and they really have no skin in the game, right? So they could just all of a sudden you have two or three designers hop off because maybe their travel expenses is too much. So I think a small investment, and then our shows here are, I guess some fashion shows are like show and tell, and mine's more like show and sell, right? So
Hmm.
every designer gets a vendor booth. So like you said, if and I don't say bet the ranch on it, there's no guarantee they're gonna make money at my show. But if they make something that they believe in and that they think the guests will purchase, then there's value in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that when it comes to sponsors, and like you said, they could either take that 7 grand and put it to radio, or 7 grand and put it to your show. They're still going to get some marketing out of it, even if they are doing it for the community, and the fashion industry, and especially like the emerging designers, and kind of supporting them. They are still getting that marketing out of it, and it's more, and they're getting a lot. They're basically paying and getting, not just radio, but they get some PR, and they get some guerrilla marketing, and you get, whatever amount of people that attend the event will see everything firsthand, like their logo, and if they have a vendor booth and materials, whatever they're doing as their sponsorship, they're still getting, there's a benefit to it,
No,
they
I
can
agree.
also sponsor, there's also, I've done a lot of research on this, on like,
Mhm.
why people sponsor fashion shows, and there's a lot of sponsors that just sponsor individual designers as well, so the designer can also, doesn't have to come out of their pocket every time.
Mhm.
They can also get a sponsor to cover their costs for a show they really want to be in. Um, but yeah, so there's so many different ways of of
No,
doing
the
it.
different ways of slicing it. It's interesting, I lived in Vegas for a long time, and obviously, Circus Soleil is huge, and that was actually Cirque du Soleil was actually started by, some of the performers. There were performers that became business people, if you will, and they travel around, so they'll come to Albuquerque, New Mexico, or whatever. It's almost like a music tour, but it's Cirque du Soleil,
Yeah,
and the same thing is again they'll be maybe BMW. They have huge sponsors that help cover the cost to travel, and then of course ticket sales. So it's interesting too because I've thought about that too. If you had like some really amazing designers that you were working with, and then you did like a tour for them, almost like a
mhm,
music band. So you say, "Oh, okay, I got these four great designers, and people actually want to see them, and then we're going to do a tour in these eight different cities." And then ideally, you'd be able to pick up either one major sponsor that would sponsor this tour, if you will, or having boots on the ground and finding sponsors in those different cities. And then I think almost like a comedy show, maybe um, you feature some local designers in each city where it doesn't really cost them any money, and they could kind of piggyback on this big tour. So I'm kind of like playing around with that in my mind, if that's feasible.
yeah,
If you can find like a headlining designer and then trying to work out some kind of value proposition for them as well.
yeah. That's a good idea. We've talked about doing something like that. That's a big job.
Yeah, it's a big job. That's the thing is how much energy do you have left to pull something like that off. So let's
Yeah.
talk about when you work with these when you were doing these concerts, if you will, were these mostly indie bands that you were working with?
Yeah. When right out of college, I worked for a music festival from a local magazine, like local um, weekly magazine here in St. Louis called the Riverfront Times. They had a music festival called the Midwest Regional Music Festival, and I think it was like 16 different states that they pulled bands from. So some were independent, some were a little bit bigger. A lot of local from St. Louis. So I've worked with all like a pretty wide range of of talent. Even interning when I out of college or when I was in college, interning for some major record labels that I worked with some bands that would come through, and my job was to be on the street and promote it and get radio play, and that was my internship. And these were bigger artists. So I've worked with all a variety of emerging all the way to the top talent.
Yeah, I remember the early days. I mean, I think the internet was still around, but passing out flyers on the street and putting,
Oh
flyers
yeah.
on the doors at different bars just to get people to come. Because before Santa Fe Fashion, I used to do film and fashion industry nights, and we do fashion shows and stuff like that. The thing I often talk about, I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I think musicians they go on tour, they press a lot of flash, maybe they sell some merch. Obviously the business model's changed. You're not selling albums anymore, but I guess you're driving traffic to wherever they could download this music. And so they're touching a lot of flesh. And I think emerging designers are similar to musicians where going to these different fashion shows or fashion weeks throughout the country, telling their story, documenting it, creating some social media content. And that's one of the reasons I think fashion shows are a value because they could plug and play and go to these different cities. And again, let their maybe call them their fans or people cover their or purchase their brand, their fashion to go to these different events and meet them in person. And I think that's the power of fashion shows. Do you kind of see it the same way, like the indie musician, indie fashion designer? Do you see any correlation in that?
Yeah, yeah, I do. We there's a lot of designers that are in the shows that I put on that are really good at marketing themselves. They're really good at pushing the event, for me,
Mhm.
because at the end of the day, it's like, we have maybe six different designers that may have, audiences that I don't have, or each designer has a different audience. So you bring all those people together, and that's what you want. You want this collaboration of things, just like in a band, when you have an opening band that maybe doesn't have that exposure, they're playing in front of people they've never played in front of before. And it kind of like relates to that when you have an emerging designer maybe that comes in and open and not just technically open,
Mhm.
but is a part of this show with a more established designer that not only can give them an audience but can give them advice or talk to them about their designs. I think it's more deep. It's a deeper meaning for them. You know, bands, they go on, they play, they get off stage, the next band plays, and then it's, maybe there's some communication in there before,
Mhm.
but during a fashion show, you start at 7, everybody's sitting down, everybody's watching, no matter you're the first or the last. And when you're done, you're backstage the whole time and you're communicating with all these other designers and collaborating and learning and hopefully getting something out of it more than just the show, getting some future opportunities out of it. So I think it's somewhat similar in that way. But even like I said, the designers I think get a little bit more, even more out of it.
That's an interesting take. I never thought about that. Yeah, the opening act. I imagine they open, and then the big stars are like, in the wherever they're, they're kind of probably a little bit cliquish, right? So maybe there's
Mhm.
no interaction. I'm a wannabe actor, and so I have an agent, but I've done a lot of background acting and stand-in acting, stuff like that. And you definitely have that, like the background actors rarely interact with the stars.
Yeah.
It's like hands on, unless they approach you. So I could see how, like you said, with the fashion shows, oftentimes we'll have like a VIP reception, and so the sponsors and designers, there's a lot of interaction and ideally relationships happening between maybe the more established designers and emerging designers, and also the opportunity for the models and photographers to meet. Because I've had like project runway designers and stuff like that in the show. So
Mhm.
it's definitely that interaction. I really thought about like with bands that there might be like almost like a wall between the bigger players and the emerging designers. So I talked to a lot of designers and even producers from like, there's these producers that produce shows in New York during New York Fashion Week, and they're not really part of New York Fashion Week, but they claim like it's part of New York Fashion Week, or
Mhm.
models that participate in these offshoots and whatnot. And there's I think there's like a sour taste in some designers. They just feel like they're spending a lot of money. They're participating in some of these shows. Maybe the producers are over promising, maybe. Or I always talk about the book, The Five Love Languages, about expectations. And so maybe the designers are expecting too much. Maybe there's a lack of discussion of what the producer of the show can deliver
Mhm.
and what the designers are expecting from the show. Again, yours and my business model is a little bit different. Designers pay money to be in my show. And then early on, I'm 10 years into this. I don't know if you've been to Magic, but these big fashion trade shows where it's 20, 30, $40,000 and more for a designer to participate. And they're looking for buyers, be it boutique owners. And
Yeah.
so early on, designers would be like, "Oh, are you going to have any buyers there?" And I kind of thought mine was more like a hybrid show where there might be some boutique owners from Santa Fe, let's say, and then the people in the audience can buy the clothing. And then by going to Magic, I'm like, well, if you really want buyers, well, then if you have that kind of money, and you have to have your lookbooks, you have to have manufacturing. I mean, you got to be ready to go. And
Mhm.
again, there's no guarantee that you're going to make any sales when you spend a lot of this money. So I just want to discuss that a little bit. Is what are the expectations? What, as you and I are both producers of fast shows, about expectations, what designers, and again, you have designers you have to keep happy, your sponsors, your models, your photographers. There's a lot of people to keep happy, right? Because they're all participating, either getting paid or not getting paid. What's your thoughts on that?
So I think nothing is guaranteed. But you as a producer want to show your love to your designers that are in your show and want to do as much as you can. Now you can get every publicist out, every retailer out, everybody that they could benefit from, and they just may not like what the collection is. It's not your fault.
Mhm.
It's just is what it is. But you have a value of the people that you're bringing to each event. Um, and I understand that, because I've heard stories of going to New York for fashion shows that aren't technically under the New York Fashion Week umbrella, but they're during the week. I guess everyone can do whatever shows they want to do. And yeah, I've heard the stories. We spent $5,000, and then we spent, you know, money to go, to travel and to stay there. You were spending, anywhere from 7,500 to, maybe 10 grand just to like have the trip itself, and then getting nothing out of it. Now, I think some of those designers are just thinking that, are just throwing, hoping that something happens, instead of maybe reaching out to buyers and retailers or publicists themselves, that are going to be in the area, and inviting them. That doesn't cost anything. That's free. Um, but I think it is, going to New York is is like almost this like, prestige trip that doesn't always pan out. And that's why it's very important that these other fashion weeks that are not New York or LA, and just kind of, like we have, like in the Midwest. I mean, I'm in the Midwest. We have Kansas City Fashion Week is strong. Our St. Louis Fashion Week was strong, really big. Omaha has a good one, and you have these other Midwest fashion shows that are bringing in these designers from New York, and bringing in these VIPs from other cities that want to see other talent in the Midwest, because it's not just on the East Coast. So I think it's super important for these other fashion weeks to be supported, and not just the New York one, because like I said, it's a crapshoot. Um, you can't, these some of these designers that are succeeding in New York have lived in New York. They're there for a very long time. You going there for like 3 days is not going to make your career explode, unless you are just like the top, you know, 3% of what they want. Does
Right.
that make sense?
No, it does. I haven't posted a video yet, but I interviewed a woman. She writes for Vogue Italia, and she's seeing a shift also where some people are kind of like not even attending, let's say New York Fashion Week or some of the bigger fashion events. They're more kind of doing like these experiences where most Americans only have maybe a couple weeks off a year. So rather than go to New York, maybe they'll go to your city or they'll go to Santa Fe, see the fashion show, and then also experience that city. So making it a mini vacation,
Mhm.
which I kind of was kind of opened my eyes a little bit. It's like, wow, never thought of it that way. And then again, and it's funny too, where designers will most of the guests in the audience, a lot more of the models' parents, and of course, some of the models are adults, right? Lots of models' parents, models' family, but they buy clothing too, and I've had dresses sell off the runway for like $500. So it's also interesting, and that's going back to going to magic again is having that conversation now that I've been around long enough where I'm talking to a designer and they're like, "Oh, there gonna be any buyers there?" It's like if that's really what you want, like retail buyers, then we're not the show for you. You should
Mhm.
go to Magic. And I've talked about this too with some models. Most shows models. There's this whole thing with hashtag models should be paid. Where New York Fashion Week, a lot of these big shows in Europe and whatnot, the models are paying for their own airfare, their own hotel. They're not getting paid. There's really not a big budget for that. So again, the conversation is if the model again, expectations. Oh, you're going to be able to pay the models. Well, if there's 50 or 60 models, and each one wants $200 or 250 or whatever the going rate might be, then we're not the right show for you. No hard feelings, right?
Mhm.
So again, having these conversations with the sponsors, designers, stuff like that. And if it means not doing business with that designer, I think it's better to have that conversation up front. If their expectations just off the charts,
Mhm.
better to have that than them kind of bashing you or having a difficult time with them at the show because we just didn't have a conversation beforehand.
Right. And I think that when you talk about the buyers and that, like, I think that is, since COVID, a lot of things have changed where you can do everything online. Um, so I'm constantly trying to figure out the best way to get that look on the runway into people's hands very quickly. There's so much technology out there now to buy right
Mhm.
away. But again, like you said, the designer has to have the inventory also to be able to do it, to sell that quickly.
Yeah, I
Because
think.
they they have one size on the runway, whatever that size may be.
Mhm.
And if that person is not that specific size, then they have to. And I've seen a lot of designers do a lot of custom, work for, they recreate whatever the look is on there. They don't have the inventory, but they still do it. But it's still not. It's got to be faster. People are impatient and they may not want to wait, 3 or 4 weeks for it to be made. They want to order it and have it, within a week.
No, that's true. It's this whole thing with sustainable fashion, which I really don't think there's such a thing because fashion's going to wear out no matter what. But you have this just in time manufacturing, right? So and that's why a lot of big fashion houses have trouble with this because if they under manufacture and there's a big demand for whatever items they're making, and this could happen with a small designer too. If they don't make enough, well, now all of a sudden they didn't meet demand, and for a lot of bigger fashion houses, unfortunately, it's less of a gamble if they over manufacture and then they hopefully don't do this anymore, but they'll send what they don't sell to like landfills and stuff like that. And so
Mhm.
it's cheaper to get rid of the garments they didn't sell, right? And make as much sales as they can. And so I think that's the issue too, is if you're participating in the show like Santa Fe Fashion Week, to have the items that you may want to sell, and then just so you can make it that immediate sale, and then maybe take some orders, and then also that conversation with the person wanting to buy it. Because if they do want to buy it and you just don't have it with you, and you can only travel with so many garments. But yeah, these are a lot of challenges. And something I've learned also is, you know, I was watching some on TikTok. It's becoming, you're seeing more of this on TikTok where you're seeing some of these days in the life videos, but also it's almost like the days of MTV or more of these reality shows that now they're more scripted, but the day in life of like getting ready for a fashion show, right? So documenting everything. So you're really squeezing as much out of that dollar, right? So if it's going to be in your show or my show, and it's a month out. Well, this is the conversation with the producer, and this is some of my challenges. Creating like a little drama. Here's
Mhm.
pictures of the road trip to the fashion show, and really just squeezing as much out. And going back to Magic, what's interesting too is so Magic and the smart designers utilize our shows as well. Is they'll use Magic, in Vegas. I think that Magic's in other cities, but they'll use that trade show to let their buyers know that they're going to be in that city, and they use that as their showroom for that day, right? So if they're going to be in Santa Fe, ideally, they're doing shout outs on their social media, like, "Hey, I'd love to meet you in person. I'm going to be at XYZ event." And again, doing that as well, because early on in my events, they're like, they expect the producers to do everything. And I think as producers, like, we provide the models, the music, the venue. Um, I think photographers, I don't even promise, like, I'll have photographers there, but I let the designers negotiate that deal with photographers directly because I don't want to be responsible if I say, okay, it's going to be $2,000 to be in my show and you're gonna get X amount of photos. And now they're not happy with the photos that they received. Not to say the photographers didn't do a great job, but again, now,
Yeah.
now you have that conversation. Now that's an issue. And then you have the ownership of photos. The photographers typically own the rights to photography. So that's just one way I handle the photography. Um, I forget where I was going with this, but again, it's the I think this little mini documentaries is the way to go if you're going to participate in these fashion shows to build that relationship. So I think if they buy an item of clothing at a fashion show, now there's a story to that clothing, and maybe pay a little bit more margin for that because now that just like a musician is, oh, I love this band, and I love what they're performing. But if maybe you just you got an album, maybe you like the music, but typically you don't know who the musician is behind it. But I think with an item of clothing, you may not know the story and the amount of work that goes into making that collection.
Yeah. And you know what? When you talk about the musicians and the designers making money, musicians, when I've, gone on the road with like, a smaller act, they may not make money on, ticket sales or from the venue, but they will make money off of merchandise. So even if you have, say I'm a designer, I don't have a big inventory of what's going to be on the runway, but I may have some branded T-shirts. I may have something that I can sell that didn't cost me a lot of money, but there's something that I can sell to make some of my money back and to brand myself. It could be T-shirts, could be, I had there was a designer, I think, in one of my shows that made like keychains, with the brand's name on it, and it didn't cost her that much. It's just like it's something that she invested in, and she can do it at other shows. So I think it's a matter of just like really thinking about it, really knowing the business. That's another issue, is that some designers don't know the business side of things.
Right.
I think schools are starting to, in the last maybe 5, 6 years or so, starting to like teach the business side of things and and marketing. Um, because when I started got in the fashion industry, which is like 15 years ago or so, it was just design and merchandising. Like no one knew how to sell what they were what they were making.
Right.
It's like they could make it and then they do a fashion show, and then they didn't know what to do after that. So I think there's it's not always the designer's fault not knowing what to do. Like I think in our education system, like there needs to be that foundation of, what do I do now that this 20-piece collection is finished? Do I do fashion shows? Do I have an online store? Do I need a brick and mortar? Like what's the best for me? And how to do that research and how to understand who your audience really is. um yeah.
That makes makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
think in closing, I just want to touch on this one thing too.
Mhm.
So when I went to Magic, I think it was last year. It's in Vegas. It's a huge event, and so they'll have areas where there's almost like a food court, if you will, and so you get your food, whatever, and it's a great time to kind of mix and mingle with the people that are there. And so I was sitting down with this woman. She's from Canada, and she was there as a buyer, and she had like I don't know 8 or 9 boutiques in Canada, and she was talking about one of her challenges was, she felt like she knew her customer, who shops at her boutique, and she bought a bunch of clothing, I think the year before. And for whatever reason, her clientele didn't really like what she was buying, what was offered at that store. And again, you know, not knowing your customer or the customer's needs change or their wants change. So now all of a sudden, she has one season to make it or break it. Now she's discounting what she has, trying to get rid of what she purchased.
Mhm.
And so yeah, that there's so many challenges, but it's interesting to sit there and talk to those people. And another person was I think he was a sales rep from Europe, and then he did I think he was doing women's fashion, but he was talking about women's fashion, men's fashion from the side of a manufacturer or from a fashion house,
Mhm.
where generally speaking, where women's clothing, the margins might be smaller, but women typically will buy more clothing than men. Men will go out and buy a suit or some jeans and
Mhm.
kind of wear the heck out of it for the most part. And maybe so you have to really get more margins maybe in men's clothing because you're not going to sell the volume. And women's fashion maybe tends more to fast fashion. So it's just a lot, to think of when again, talking to the boutique owner, talking to the buyers, talking, you know, to the people that are participating at Magic. Because again, it's interesting because you'll walk through Magic and you'll see like some fashion houses. I mean, they're writing orders and it's 10 deep. I mean, people are just they're right, buying a lot of stuff. And there might be a vendor booth right across the way. And I don't know, maybe their fashion's just as good, but they don't have those relationships and they're just not getting any traction. So there's a lot of challenges watching that point where they did spend a lot of money and they're not making sales. And then the other challenge too, I think for designers is you'll have fashion houses that they built a relationship with these buyers. Maybe these buyers aren't even attending Magic anymore because they have a good relationship. They'll just go to the fashion house's website and just buy more, the next season's collection. And it might not even be the best designer, but there's a relationship there. They know they're going to deliver just in time. They have the relationship. They don't have to go to Vegas anymore to go to Magic. And so as an emerging designer, you're also fighting with that because you're like, I'm not established. I'm far better. And you probably see this in music as well, right? I'm a
Mhm.
much better designer, but I just cannot get traction. So breaking through that, and I have this do a little plug I do a lot of marketing for my good friend Dr. Andy has this energy drink, Beyond Energy. The energy drink market is interesting because he's got like 3 SKUs. You have to come up with a different flavor every season, if you will.
Oh
But
yeah.
we're still fighting for shelf space, just like a fashion designer is fighting for shelf space to be in a boutique. And it's like, God, how do I break through? And with the energy drink, is like, today I'll go to some convenience stores. Some of the vendors, so you get in the stores, and some of the gas stations, whatever, aren't even paying their bill. So now the distributor doesn't want to distribute anymore, which I get that. And you get people hooked on that drink and the drink's not there anymore. So, and that's just the beverage industry. And then you look at a fashion house, with every season, you know, building your brand just has to deal with his energy drink, but building the brand of your clothing, and then talking again, kind of talking about magic, where some designers feel like it's the boutique's job to drive traffic to the boutique to buy that clothing. And then some boutiques feel like it's the fashion house's job to say, hey, my clothing is available in XYZ cities, and ideally driving traffic not only to online sales, but driving traffic to that boutique.
Yeah. Really quick, I'm going to step in on that because that's a good point about, I've worked in, I don't know, 3 or 4 different boutiques, and having a local designers in there is really exciting. Um, but if we don't have the tools in the store to actually sell what they have, it makes it really difficult to put it in people's hands. Like if we don't have like the end caps or the marketing or whatever it is, the branding side of things. If you're just dropping off stuff and expecting magic to happen, like you need to have, and that's with everything. You need to have branding, marketing, materials to help push your product out of that retailer. Just like your friend with the energy drink, I'm sure they have marketing materials to put in the grocery stores to like sell their product. They're just not dropping the product off and expecting it to like fly off the shelves.
Well, it's interesting too. I think, and I talked to another one. She worked kind of like a stylist at some boutiques, I think in Dallas or something like that. And so, you go into a clothing store, if you really have a good sales team, sales clerk, and they could say, "Oh, that dress looks amazing on you. That suit looks amazing," and so they could kind of push that product in a way and be a salesperson, if you will. Going back to the energy drink, the clerk behind the counter, collecting money is not going to say, "Hey, go try that energy drink." So we
Right.
do a lot of demos and stuff like that. But it's interesting, again, going back to marketing and branding, driving traffic either for a fashion brand. Well, I really love this designer. Look at like the old Ed Hardy or whatever.
Mhm.
And so people were really driven by that brand. And then again, how much is up to the store, and then for designers to realize like that store is taking a huge gamble, because if that stuff doesn't sell, and the rent just keeps, you got to keep paying that rent on that boutique.
Mhm.
And if your stuff doesn't sell, or worst case, they place an order at Magic or one of our shows and they don't deliver it in time, they're going to have an empty store. So I
Mhm.
think designers have to also realize that, the boutiques are taking a huge gamble.
And some designers, you just make a decision. Do you want to sell in retail, or you want to be, you know, bespoke or custom made?
Or well, the
Yeah,
wholesale model or
yeah,
the direct to consumer
yeah,
model. So there's a
right.
lot of stuff. We could go on and on, but I really want to thank you, Dwight. I think I'd love to have you on again sometime and talk more about the branding and marketing, because it sounds like you know a lot about that as well. But I
Mhm.
think today we just covered a lot about event planning. If you're working the fashion industry and this is something you thought about, because I think even designers could do their own shows if they wanted to, but understanding some of the challenges of that. But again, Dwight, I want to thank you for being a guest on our podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, Dwight, have a great day. Take care now.
All right, you too.